The grand hall of the Vatican's Apostolic Palace buzzed with quiet anticipation. Distinguished guests from around the world had gathered for what was being called the most prestigious musical event of the decade. Cardinals in crimson robes lined the marble walls, while diplomats and cultural ministers filled the velvet chairs arranged in perfect rows. At the center of it all sat Pope Leo XIV, a man known throughout the Catholic world for his stern demeanor and unwavering commitment to tradition. The evening had been months in planning. The Vatican's Cultural Committee had organized a special concert to celebrate the restoration of the Sistine Chapel's ancient organ. They had invited the world's finest musicians to perform, but one name stood above all others on the guest list: Alessandro Moretti, the famous Italian pianist whose fingers were said to make even stone weep with emotion. Alessandro had a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. At 38 years old, he had performed in every major concert hall from Vienna to Tokyo. His interpretations of classical masterpieces left audiences breathless, and critics struggled to find adequate words to describe his talent. But Alessandro was known for something else too. He was outspoken, fearless, and never afraid to challenge authority, even when that authority wore the papal tiara. The Pope had specifically requested Alessandro's presence at this event. It was meant to be a gesture of goodwill, a bridge between the Church and the modern world of art and culture. The Vatican had carefully crafted the evening's program, selecting pieces that would showcase both religious devotion and artistic excellence. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail, from the flower arrangements to the exact angle of the spotlight that would illuminate the grand piano. As the audience settled into their seats, Alessandro stood backstage, running his fingers through his dark hair. He wore a simple black suit, refusing the more ornate attire the Vatican officials had suggested. His assistant, Maria, handed him a glass of water and whispered words of encouragement, but Alessandro seemed distracted. He kept glancing at the program in his hand, his jaw tightening with each passing moment. The concert began with a choir performing Gregorian chants, their voices rising toward the frescoed ceiling like prayers made audible. Then came a string quartet playing Bach, followed by a renowned soprano singing Ave Maria. Each performance was met with polite, reverent applause. The atmosphere was one of controlled elegance, exactly as the Vatican had intended. Finally, it was Alessandro's turn. The master of ceremonies, a senior cardinal with a voice like aged wine, stepped to the podium and began his introduction. He spoke of Alessandro's achievements, his numerous awards, and his deep connection to Italian musical heritage. He described the piece Alessandro would perform, a complex composition by Mozart that required both technical precision and emotional depth. The audience leaned forward in their seats, eager to witness greatness. Alessandro walked onto the stage, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He bowed slightly to the Pope, then to the audience before taking his seat at the magnificent Steinway piano that had been brought in specifically for this occasion. The instrument gleamed under the lights, its black surface reflecting the golden decorations of the room. Alessandro adjusted the bench, flexed his fingers, and placed his hands over the keys. But he did not begin to play. Instead, Alessandro turned his head toward the Pope and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried through the silent hall. What he said next would change everything about that carefully planned evening and send shockwaves through the Vatican that would be felt for months to come. Alessandro looked directly at Pope Leo XIV and said that he would not be performing the piece that had been selected for him. The audience gasped, a sound like wind rushing through leaves. Cardinals exchanged troubled glances. The Pope's expression remained unchanged, but his fingers gripped the armrest of his ornate chair just a fraction tighter. The pianist explained that he had reviewed the evening's program and found it to be a perfect representation of everything that troubled him about the institutional church. Every piece of music selected celebrated power, tradition, and hierarchy. There was nothing that spoke to the suffering of ordinary people, nothing that acknowledged the struggles of the poor, nothing that reflected the real world beyond the Vatican's golden walls. Alessandro's voice grew stronger as he continued. He spoke of the thousands of families in Rome living in poverty, while the church sat on immeasurable wealth. He mentioned the sex abuse scandals that had rocked the Catholic world, the victims who had been silenced, and the lack of real accountability. He talked about the church's treatment of women, its stance on social issues, and its reluctance to embrace meaningful reform. The hall erupted in chaos. Some audience members began shouting for Alessandro to be removed from the stage. Others sat frozen in shock, unable to process what they were witnessing. Security guards took steps toward the piano, but the Pope raised a single hand, stopping them in their tracks. Pope Leo XIV wanted to hear what else this bold pianist had to say. Alessandro then made an announcement that left everyone speechless. Instead of performing Mozart, he would play a piece he had composed himself. He called it Requiem for the Forgotten, and he dedicated it to every person who had been harmed, ignored, or marginalized by the institutional church throughout history. He said it was time for the Vatican to listen to uncomfortable truths, rather than just beautiful melodies that made everyone feel righteous and comfortable. Before anyone could stop him, Alessandro's fingers descended upon the keys. The music that poured forth was unlike anything the Vatican's walls had ever contained. It was raw, painful, and achingly honest. It began with dissonant chords that made people wince, representing suffering and injustice. Then it evolved into a haunting melody that seemed to cry out for mercy and understanding. The composition wove together elements of classical structure with modern harmonies, creating something that was both deeply traditional and radically new. As Alessandro played, something extraordinary happened in that grand hall. The initial shock began to fade, replaced by something else entirely. People stopped whispering and simply listened. Some began to cry, moved by the raw emotion pouring from the piano. Even some of the cardinals found themselves unable to maintain their expressions of outrage, their faces softening as the music reached into places they had long kept guarded. The Pope sat perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Alessandro's form at the piano. His face remained an unreadable mask, but those who knew him well noticed subtle changes. A slight tension around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his breathing. Pope Leo XIV was listening, truly listening, perhaps for the first time in years, to a voice that challenged rather than praised him. The final notes of Alessandro's composition hung in the air like incense smoke, slowly dissipating into the vast space of the hall. For several seconds, nobody moved. The silence was so complete that the ticking of the antique clock in the corner became audible, each second passing like a small eternity. Alessandro sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. He had poured everything into that performance, and now he waited for the consequences. Pope Leo XIII rose from his chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of authority that had been built over centuries of papal tradition. Every eye in the room turned toward him. The cardinals prepared themselves to follow his lead, whether that meant applauding politely or calling for the pianist's immediate removal from the premises. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. What happened next shocked everyone present even more than Alessandro's bold performance. Instead of showing anger or calling for order, the Pope began to walk toward the stage. His steps were measured, his expression still carefully neutral, but something in his bearing had changed. He climbed the 3 steps that led to the platform where the piano sat, moving with a grace that belied his 72 years. Alessandro stood up from the piano bench, unsure of what to expect. Would the Pope publicly rebuke him? Have him arrested? Excommunicate him on the spot? The pianist straightened his shoulders, preparing himself for whatever judgment was about to come. He had known the risks when he decided to speak his truth in this sacred space, and he was ready to face them. The Pope stopped just a few feet away from Alessandro, close enough that only those in the front rows could hear what he said next. His voice was soft but carried an unexpected quality. He told Alessandro that in his 40 years of service to the Church, including 15 as Pope, no one had ever dared to speak to him with such raw honesty. He said that most people who entered his presence came with requests, flattery, or carefully prepared speeches designed to please rather than challenge. Then Pope Leo XIV did something that would be discussed in Vatican circles for years to come. He asked Alessandro a simple question. Would the pianist be willing to have a private conversation with him? Not a formal audience with scribes recording every word, not a public dialogue for the cameras, but a genuine, honest conversation between 2 men about the state of the Church and the world. Alessandro was taken completely off guard. He had expected many possible reactions to his bold performance, but this sincere invitation was not among them. He studied the Pope's face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden anger, but found only what appeared to be genuine curiosity and perhaps a hint of weariness that the public rarely saw. After a moment of consideration, Alessandro agreed. The Pope turned to address the confused and agitated audience. He announced that the evening's program would conclude early due to unexpected circumstances. He thanked everyone for attending and asked them to reflect on what they had heard. Then, with a gesture to Alessandro to follow him, Pope Leo XIV left the stage through a side door, leaving behind a hall full of stunned dignitaries and bewildered clergy. The two men walked through the Vatican's private corridors, trailed at a discreet distance by security personnel, who seemed as confused as everyone else about what was happening. They passed through rooms filled with priceless art, libraries containing manuscripts that dated back over 1,000 years, and chapels where countless prayers had been offered. Alessandro found himself noticing details he had never paid attention to before during his previous visits to the Vatican. Between the beauty and wealth, there were also signs of age and decay, cracks in the plaster, faded colors in tapestries, the weight of history pressing down on everything. They arrived at a small private study that was clearly the Pope's personal workspace, rather than any of the grand official rooms used for ceremonies and audiences. Books were stacked on every available surface, some with markers sticking out from between their pages. A simple wooden desk held papers covered in handwritten notes. A window looked out over the Vatican gardens where the evening light was beginning to fade into dusk. The Pope gestured for Alessandro to sit in one of the two comfortable chairs near the window. He dismissed his attendants with a wave, leaving the two men alone. Then he did something that surprised Alessandro even more. He removed the heavy papal ring from his finger and set it on the desk. He loosened the top button of his cassock and sat down across from the pianist with a long, tired sigh. For a moment, neither man spoke. The Pope stared out the window at the gardens below, where a gardener was pushing a wheelbarrow along a stone path. When he finally turned his attention back to Alessandro, his expression had softened in a way the world rarely witnessed. He told the pianist that he wanted to hear everything Alessandro had held back during his public performance. No filters, no diplomacy, just the unvarnished truth as Alessandro saw it. Alessandro hesitated at first. Speaking truth to power in a public performance was one thing, but sitting alone with the Pope in his private study was quite another. Yet something in the older man's demeanor encouraged honesty, so Alessandro began to speak, and once he started, the words flowed like water breaking through a dam. He talked about his childhood in Naples, growing up in a neighborhood where the church's presence was everywhere, but its help seemed to go to those who needed it least. He described watching his own mother, a devout Catholic who attended Mass every Sunday, struggle to put food on the table while the local parish priest drove a luxury car. He spoke of friends who had been abused by clergy members and then silenced by a system more concerned with protecting its reputation than protecting children. Alessandro continued, describing his travels around the world and the contrast he saw between the Vatican's wealth and the poverty of millions of Catholics globally. He talked about talented women he knew who could never fully participate in church leadership because of their gender. He mentioned LGBTQ friends who had been made to feel unwelcome in the very institution that preached universal love. The Pope listened without interrupting, his face betraying nothing of his internal reactions. When Alessandro finally fell silent, having exhausted his list of grievances and observations, the Pope remained quiet for several more moments. The room grew darker as the sun set completely, and a Swiss guard discreetly entered to turn on a few lamps before exiting again. Then Pope Leo XIV began to speak, and what he said would form the foundation of everything that happened next. He admitted something that he had never voiced publicly before. He told Alessandro that he often felt trapped by the very institution he led, bound by centuries of tradition and protocol that made meaningful change almost impossible. He spoke of proposals he had wanted to implement, reforms he had dreamed of, but which had been blocked by the Curia, by conservative cardinals, by the sheer weight of institutional inertia. The Pope described the loneliness of his position, surrounded by advisors and attendants but rarely able to speak freely or hear honest feedback. He talked about lying awake at night, troubled by the same issues Alessandro had raised but feeling powerless to address them in any substantial way. He admitted that he sometimes wondered if his papacy would be remembered merely as another, in a long line of leaders who maintained the status quo, rather than embracing necessary transformation. Alessandro found himself seeing the Pope not as an untouchable religious figure, but as a human being carrying an impossible burden. The pianist asked why, if the Pope felt this way, he did not simply use his authority to make the changes he believed were necessary. The Pope smiled sadly and explained that papal authority was not as absolute as people imagined. Every decision required navigating complex political waters, balancing various factions within the Church, and considering potential schisms that could tear the faithful apart. As their conversation deepened into the night, Alessandro and Pope Leo XIV discovered something unexpected. Despite their vastly different positions in life, they shared a common frustration with systems that seemed designed to resist change. The pianist had spent his career fighting against the rigid traditionalism of classical music establishments, while the Pope struggled against the even more entrenched traditions of the Catholic Church. Both men had experienced the loneliness of being voices calling for evolution in institutions that valued preservation above all else. The Pope rose from his chair and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a worn leather journal. He explained that he had been keeping private notes for years, documenting his thoughts on needed reforms and his struggles to implement them. He had never shown these writings to anyone, not even his closest advisors, but something about the evening's events and Alessandro's raw honesty made him want to share them now. Alessandro read through page after page of the Pope's handwritten reflections. The entries revealed a man deeply troubled by the gap between the Church's teachings about compassion and mercy and its actual treatment of vulnerable people. There were notes about wanting to establish more transparent financial systems, ideas for empowering women in church leadership, thoughts on addressing the abuse crisis more directly, and concerns about the Church's disconnect from the struggles of ordinary believers. What struck Alessandro most powerfully was the date on many of these entries. Some went back decades to when the future Pope Leo XIV was just a cardinal in Milan. Even then, he had seen the problems clearly and yearned to address them. But as he rose through the ranks of church hierarchy, he found himself increasingly constrained by the very system he hoped to reform. Each promotion brought more responsibility but also more limitation, until he reached the highest position of all and discovered it was, in some ways, the most powerless. Alessandro closed the journal and looked at the Pope with new understanding. He realized that his public challenge earlier that evening, while cathartic and necessary, had also been somewhat simplistic. He had assumed that the Pope simply did not care about the issues he raised, when in reality, the situation was far more complicated. The pianist apologized, not for speaking his truth, but for perhaps not fully understanding the complexity of trying to lead institutional change from within such a massive, ancient organization. The Pope waved away the apology with a gentle gesture. He said that Alessandro's public performance had actually given him something valuable, a clear articulation of concerns that resonated with millions, but were rarely expressed so directly in the Vatican's ornate halls. He suggested that perhaps they could work together to find ways to bridge the gap between the Church's ideals and its realities. Alessandro was skeptical. What could a pianist possibly do to help reform the Catholic Church? He had no theological training, no understanding of canon law, and no position within the institutional hierarchy. But the Pope had a different perspective. He explained that sometimes the most valuable voices came from outside the system, from people who could see clearly because they were not blinded by tradition or trapped by institutional thinking. Over the next hour, the two men began to sketch out an unprecedented plan. The Pope proposed creating a series of public dialogues where he would invite artists, intellectuals, activists, and ordinary believers to challenge him directly on the Church's shortcomings and needed reforms. These would not be scripted events or carefully managed public relations exercises, but genuine conversations about difficult topics. Alessandro would help organize these dialogues and participate in the first one. The pianist was both excited and terrified by this proposal. He understood that such an initiative could either lead to meaningful change or could backfire spectacularly and make things worse. He asked the Pope what he hoped to accomplish through these dialogues. The older man thought for a moment before responding that he did not expect immediate dramatic changes. But he hoped to begin shifting the culture of the Vatican from one of defensive protection to one of honest self-examination. Their planning session was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. The Pope's personal secretary entered, Clearly anxious about the unusual situation, he informed the Pope that the evening's events had already begun spreading through news channels and social media. Videos of Alessandro's performance and speech were going viral, with millions of views accumulating by the hour. The Vatican's press office was being bombarded with requests for comment and clarification. The Pope asked to see some of the coverage. His secretary pulled out a tablet and showed them various news headlines and social media reactions. The responses were incredibly divided. Some praised Alessandro for his courage and called for the Pope to address his criticism seriously. Others condemned the pianist as disrespectful and demanded an apology. Religious conservatives were calling for Alessandro to be banned from ever performing in Catholic venues again. Progressive Catholics were celebrating him as a prophetic voice. What surprised both men was the sheer volume of discussion the incident had generated. Clearly, Alessandro's performance had touched a nerve that went far beyond the walls of the Vatican. Millions of people around the world had been waiting for someone to voice these concerns publicly, and the pianist's bold action had given them permission to speak about their own doubts and frustrations with the institutional church. The Pope made a decision. Rather than having his press office issue a standard diplomatic statement, he would personally record a video message addressing what had happened. His secretary immediately protested, arguing that such an unprecedented move required careful consideration and consultation with various Vatican departments. But the Pope was firm. He had spent too many years letting others filter and moderate his words. Tonight he would speak directly and honestly. They moved to a simple room with good lighting where the Pope often recorded brief messages for special occasions. Alessandro stood off to the side, watching as the Pope positioned himself in front of the camera without any of the usual elaborate staging. The papal photographer, hastily summoned from his residence, set up the equipment while looking thoroughly confused about why this was happening so late at night and without proper preparation. When everything was ready, Pope Leo XIV looked directly into the camera and began to speak. His words were not scripted, not reviewed by committees, not carefully crafted to offend no one. Instead, he spoke from the heart about what had transpired that evening. He acknowledged that Alessandro Moretti had challenged him publicly in a way that many found disrespectful, but he personally found illuminating. The Pope admitted that the pianist had raised valid concerns about the Church's failings and shortcomings. He did not excuse these problems or offer justifications for them. Instead, he simply acknowledged their reality and his own struggles to address them adequately. He spoke about the need for the Church to listen more and defend less, to embrace honest criticism rather than reflexively rejecting it. Then the Pope made an announcement that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. He was establishing a new initiative called the Open Forum, where he would regularly meet with people from all walks of life, including critics of the Church, to discuss difficult questions and concerns. These meetings would be recorded and made public with no topics off limits. He invited Alessandro Moretti to be his first dialogue partner in this new initiative. Furthermore, the Pope announced that he was forming a special commission to review the Church's financial transparency, its handling of abuse cases, and its policies regarding the participation of women and marginalized groups in church life. This commission would include not just clergy and theologians, but also lay experts, victims' advocates, and even some who had left the Church due to these very issues. As the Pope finished his statement, Alessandro felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had walked into the Vatican that evening expecting to make a statement and face consequences. He never imagined that his act of defiance might actually catalyze real change. But he also understood that announcements were easy, while implementation would be incredibly difficult. The real test would come in the following weeks and months as these promises either materialized into genuine reform or faded into empty gestures. The video was uploaded to the Vatican's official channels within the hour. Almost immediately, it began generating even more discussion than Alessandro's original performance. Some Vatican insiders were horrified, seeing the Pope's response as a dangerous capitulation to secular critics. Others were cautiously optimistic, hoping this might represent a genuine turning point. Outside the Church, reactions ranged from surprised approval to cynical skepticism about whether any real change would follow. As Alessandro finally prepared to leave the Vatican in the early hours of the morning, the Pope walked him to the door personally, another breach of typical protocol. The older man placed a hand on the pianist's shoulder and thanked him for his courage. He admitted that he was not sure where this new path would lead, but he felt more alive and purposeful than he had in years. Alessandro responded that courage was easier to find when you had less to lose, and that the Pope was taking the far greater risk. The morning after the concert brought chaos that no one in the Vatican had anticipated. Alessandro woke up in his Rome apartment to find his phone flooded with hundreds of messages and missed calls. News outlets from around the world wanted interviews. Fellow musicians were reaching out with messages of support or criticism. His social media following had exploded overnight, growing from a few thousand followers to over 2 million people who wanted to hear more from the pianist who had dared to challenge the Pope. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican walls, Pope Leo XIV faced a different kind of storm. He had barely slept after Alessandro left, spending the pre-dawn hours in prayer and reflection. When he emerged for his morning meetings, he was met with a delegation of senior cardinals who demanded an immediate audience. Their faces were grave and their intentions were clear. They wanted the Pope to walk back his announcements and discipline the pianist who had embarrassed the Church. Cardinal Rossini, the most conservative member of the Curia, and a man who had opposed Pope Leo XIV's election from the beginning, led the charge. He argued that the Pope's response to Alessandro's disrespectful performance had been far too conciliatory. The Church could not appear weak or willing to bend to every critic who came along. By treating Alessandro's accusations seriously rather than dismissing them, the Pope had given credibility to attacks on the institution that had stood for 2,000 years. Other cardinals joined in with their own concerns. They worried about the precedent being set. If artists and activists could publicly criticize the Pope without consequence, where would it end? They questioned the wisdom of the proposed open forum, suggesting it would only provide a platform for the Church's enemies. They expressed alarm at the idea of including non-clergy and even former Catholics on the Reform Commission, arguing that doctrinal matters should remain in the hands of those with proper theological training. Pope Leo XIV listened patiently to all their objections. When they finally fell silent, waiting for him to acknowledge his mistake and adjust course, he surprised them once again. He thanked them for their concerns and acknowledged that his decisions the previous night had been unconventional. But he had no intention of reversing them. In fact, he believed that avoiding difficult conversations and dismissing legitimate criticism had done more damage to the Church than any external attack ever could. The Pope reminded the cardinals of the declining attendance at Mass across much of the world, the growing numbers of young people leaving the Church, and the deep wounds caused by scandals that had been covered up rather than addressed honestly. He suggested that perhaps the real threat to the Church was not bold pianists asking hard questions, but an institutional culture that prioritized image protection over truth and genuine pastoral care. Cardinal Rossini's face flushed red with anger. He accused the Pope of being naive about the realities of leadership and allowing himself to be manipulated by a performer seeking attention. He warned that if this course continued, there would be serious consequences, including the possibility of organized resistance from conservative bishops around the world. The threat hung in the air like smoke, unspoken but clearly understood. He was suggesting the potential for schism. The Pope met Cardinal Rossini's gaze steadily and spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried undeniable authority. He acknowledged that schism was always a risk when pursuing significant change, but so was slow death through irrelevance. He would rather lead a smaller, more honest church than preside over a large institution that had lost its moral credibility and connection to the real struggles of believers. He thanked the cardinals for their input and dismissed them, making it clear that the discussion was over. As news of the confrontation spread through the Vatican's corridors, people began choosing sides. Some clergy members quietly expressed support for the Pope's new direction, relieved that someone was finally willing to address long-ignored problems. Others aligned with the conservative faction, worried about the breakdown of tradition and order. The Vatican, usually so careful about presenting a unified front to the world, was beginning to show visible cracks. Alessandro, unaware of the battles being fought inside the Vatican, was dealing with his own challenges. His phone kept ringing with interview requests, but he was hesitant to speak publicly without coordinating with the Pope's office. He did not want to accidentally undermine whatever the Pope was trying to accomplish. At the same time, he felt obligated to respond to the many people who were reaching out to share their own stories of frustration with the Church. His apartment doorbell rang around noon, Alessandro opened it to find two men in dark suits who identified themselves as Vatican security. They had been sent to bring him back to meet with the Pope again. Alessandro felt a moment of fear, wondering if perhaps the Pope had changed his mind and he was about to face consequences after all. But the security officers assured him this was a friendly invitation, not an arrest. The drive back to the Vatican took them through Rome's bustling streets, past tourists taking photos and locals going about their daily business. Alessandro noticed how normal everything seemed outside, while inside his own life and inside the Vatican, everything was being turned upside down. He wondered if the average person walking past them had any idea of the drama unfolding behind the ancient walls they were approaching. This time, Alessandro was taken to a different part of the Vatican complex, an area that served as working offices rather than ceremonial spaces. The Pope was waiting in a conference room with several other people, including a few Alessandro recognized from news coverage. There was Cardinal Martinez, known as one of the more progressive voices in the church hierarchy. Sister Catherine, an American nun who ran an organization serving homeless women and had been critical of church policies. Father Dominic, a Nigerian priest who worked extensively with refugees, and Maria Santos, a Brazilian woman who had left the priesthood formation program after years of feeling called to ordination, but being denied because of her gender. The Pope introduced everyone and explained that these were some of the people he wanted to include in the first open forum dialogue. He had decided to move quickly rather than letting the momentum from the previous night dissipate. The event would take place in just 3 days, giving them limited time to prepare but also preventing too much overthinking and political maneuvering that might water down the honest exchange he was hoping for. Alessandro looked around the table at these diverse faces and realized the Pope was serious about creating something genuinely different. This was not going to be a carefully staged event where everyone said polite things and nothing really changed. The people gathered here had real grievances, deep questions, and no interest in simply validating the status quo. They spent the next several hours planning how the dialogue would work. The Pope insisted on minimal structure. He wanted genuine conversation, not prepared speeches. He would open with a brief statement. Then each participant would have the opportunity to raise whatever concerns or questions they felt were most important. No topic would be off limits, including the most controversial issues facing the Church. Sister Catherine immediately tested this promise by asking if they could discuss the ordination of women. The room fell silent, everyone waiting to see how the Pope would respond to this most contentious of topics. Pope Leo XIV did not hesitate. He said that yes, they could and should discuss it, along with celibacy requirements for priests, the Church's teachings on sexuality, financial transparency, and anything else that participants felt needed addressing. Maria Santos asked a harder question. She wanted to know what would happen after the dialogue. Would it just be a cathartic conversation that ultimately changed nothing? Or was the Pope prepared to actually implement reforms based on what he heard? The Pope admitted that he could not promise specific outcomes because some changes would require complex processes involving bishops' conferences and potentially even church councils. But he pledged that he would not let this become just empty theater. He would publicly commit to specific actions based on the dialogue, and he would report regularly on progress. Father Dominic raised concerns about safety, both physical and professional. He pointed out that participating in this public dialogue would likely make all of them targets for criticism from conservative factions. Some might face serious career consequences or even threats. The Pope acknowledged this reality and said that anyone who felt too vulnerable to participate would be completely understood if they chose to step back. But those who did participate would have his full support and protection. No one left the table. Despite the risks, each person present felt called to be part of what might be a historic moment of honesty and potential transformation. They recognized that opportunities like this came rarely, if ever, in institutions as ancient and resistant to change as the Catholic Church. Whatever happened next, they would at least know they had tried to make a difference. As the meeting concluded, Alessandro found himself in conversation with Maria Santos. She told him that his performance the previous night had moved her to tears, because it articulated feelings she had carried for years but never quite found the words to express. She had been on the verge of completely walking away from the church that she still loved, despite its rejection of her calling. Now, for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope that things might actually change. The 3 days leading up to the open forum felt like 3 years. Alessandro spent his time fielding media requests, coordinating with the other participants, and dealing with an increasing amount of both support and backlash from the public. His email inbox was flooded with thousands of messages. Some were from Catholics thanking him for giving voice to their frustrations. Others were angry denunciations calling him an enemy of the faith and worse. One message particularly affected Alessandro. It came from a man named Thomas who wrote about being abused by a priest as a teenager, and then having his complaints dismissed by church officials who were more concerned about scandal than justice. Thomas said he had left the church decades ago and never thought he would care about anything related to it again. But Alessandro's performance and the Pope's response had stirred something in him. For the first time in 40 years, he allowed himself to feel a small measure of hope that the institution that had harmed him might actually acknowledge its failures and change. Alessandro shared Thomas's message with the Pope during one of their preparation meetings. The older man read it slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he reached the end. He was quiet for a long moment before speaking. He said that messages like this reminded him why the open forum was necessary, despite all the political risks and institutional resistance. Real people had been deeply wounded by the Church's failures, and no amount of beautiful liturgy or theological arguments could heal those wounds without honest acknowledgement and genuine change. Meanwhile, the opposition to the Pope's initiative was growing more organized and vocal. A group of conservative bishops released a joint statement expressing their profound concern about the direction of the papacy. They stopped short of directly challenging the Pope's authority, but their message was clear. They viewed the open forum as a dangerous capitulation to secular critics and a betrayal of church tradition. Several prominent conservative Catholic media outlets ran editorials predicting disaster. The Vatican's press office was overwhelmed trying to manage the narrative. The head of communications, a seasoned diplomat named Monsignor Bellini, tried repeatedly to convince the Pope to allow more control over the open forum format. He suggested having questions submitted in advance, screening participants more carefully, and ensuring there were clear boundaries on what could be discussed. The Pope politely but firmly declined all these suggestions. If they were going to do this, they would do it honestly, or not at all. On the morning of the open forum, Alessandro woke early and went for a walk along the Tiber River to clear his mind. The city was just beginning to stir, with shop owners opening their doors and early morning commuters hurrying to work. He thought about how normal everything looked, while he was about to participate in something that felt monumental. He wondered if he had made a terrible mistake by challenging the Pope in such a public way, or if this might actually lead to something positive. The venue chosen for the open forum was itself significant. Rather than using one of the Vatican's grand ceremonial halls, the Pope had selected a simple conference room in the Paul VI Audience Hall. The space could hold about 200 people, mostly clergy and Vatican staff who had been invited to witness the dialogue. But more importantly, the entire event would be live-streamed without editing or delay, allowing anyone in the world to watch. Alessandro arrived 2 hours early and found the other participants already there, looking as nervous as he felt. Maria Santos was pacing and rehearsing what she wanted to say. Father Dominic sat quietly in prayer. Sister Catherine reviewed her notes one final time. Cardinal Martinez, who would be moderating the discussion, was testing the audio equipment. The technical crew made final adjustments to cameras and lighting, aware that millions of people would be watching every moment. The Pope entered the room just 30 minutes before the scheduled start time. He wore simple white vestments rather than elaborate ceremonial attire, another symbolic choice that did not go unnoticed. He spent a few minutes speaking privately with each participant, offering words of encouragement and thanking them for their courage. When he came to Alessandro, he placed both hands on the pianist's shoulders and said something that Alessandro would never forget. He said that sometimes the greatest act of faith was to question rather than to blindly accept, and that the Church needed more people willing to ask hard questions. As the start time approached, the audience filled the room. Alessandro noticed the mix of expressions on the faces looking back at them. Some people appeared hopeful and excited. Others looked skeptical or even hostile. Several cardinals sat in the front row with their arms crossed and faces set in stern disapproval. The tension in the room was palpable. Cardinal Martinez opened the session with a brief prayer, then turned the floor over to Pope Leo XIII. The Pope stood and looked out at the assembled group, both those physically present and the unseen millions watching online. He began by acknowledging that what they were about to do was unusual, perhaps unprecedented in modern church history. He explained that he had been moved by Alessandro Moretti's performance to recognize that the church needed to create more spaces for honest dialogue about its failures and challenges. The Pope spoke about his own journey of faith, including moments of doubt and struggle. He admitted that reaching the highest position in the church had not brought him all the answers, but rather had made him more aware of how much he did not know. He said that he was tired of pretending to have perfect understanding of God's will, when he was just a flawed human being trying his best to serve. This vulnerability from the Pope visibly surprised many in the audience, who were accustomed to papal statements that projected certainty and authority. Then the Pope invited Alessandro to speak first. The pianist stood, took a deep breath, and began to share his story in more detail than he had during his performance. He talked about growing up loving both music and his Catholic faith, but slowly becoming disillusioned as he witnessed the disconnect between the Church's teachings and its actions. He described the moment he decided he could no longer remain silent, even knowing the personal and professional risks involved. Alessandro then posed a direct question to the Pope. He asked how the Church could claim moral authority to guide people's lives when it had so spectacularly failed to address abuse, protect the vulnerable, and live up to its own stated values. The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and challenging. Some members of the audience shifted uneasily in their seats, but the Pope did not deflect or offer a theological justification. Instead, he said simply that the Church could not claim such authority unless it earned it through honest accountability and genuine reform. This admission opened the floodgates. Maria Santos spoke next, sharing her painful experience of feeling called to priesthood but being told that her gender made this impossible. Not because of any lack of capability or faith, but simply because of tradition. She asked the Pope directly whether he believed God's call was limited by human rules about who could serve in what capacity. The Pope admitted that this was a question that troubled him deeply, and that he did not have a fully satisfactory answer, but he was committed to exploring it honestly, rather than simply defending the status quo. Father Dominic described his work with refugees and the massive human suffering he witnessed daily. He challenged the Pope and the Church to move beyond statements of concern to concrete action that matched the scale of the crisis. He spoke about children dying in refugee camps while the Vatican sat on billions in assets and property. His words were passionate and at times angry, but also came from a place of deep caring about both the Church and the suffering world it claimed to serve. Sister Catherine brought up the sex abuse crisis directly, pulling no punches in her criticism of how the institutional Church had protected predators while silencing victims. She demanded to know what specific steps would be taken to ensure this never happened again, and to provide justice for those who had been harmed. The Pope listened without interrupting, even as her words grew more pointed and some audience members looked ready to object. When she finished, he thanked her for her honesty and admitted that nothing the Church had done to date had been adequate to address this moral catastrophe. For over 3 hours, the dialogue continued. Questions and challenges came not just from the panel participants, but also from some audience members whom Cardinal Martinez invited to speak. A young priest asked about the loneliness of mandatory celibacy. A laywoman questioned why women could run Catholic hospitals and schools but not celebrate Mass. A theologian raised concerns about the Church's teachings on sexuality and how they were causing harm to LGBTQ Catholics. An economist suggested that the Vatican's financial opacity undermined its credibility when speaking about justice and transparency. Through it all, Pope Leo XIV listened, responded with honesty about his own uncertainties, and avoided the defensive posturing that usually characterized official Church responses to criticism. He acknowledged mistakes, admitted to struggles, and committed to specific actions. He announced that the Abuse Commission would have independent authority to investigate cases without Vatican interference. He pledged to release detailed financial statements about Vatican holdings and expenditures. He said he would convene a special synod to discuss the question of women's ordination, making no promises about the outcome, but committing to genuine discernment rather than simply reaffirming existing policy. As the session drew to a close, Alessandro felt emotionally exhausted but also strangely hopeful. They had not solved any of the Church's problems in one afternoon, but they had at least named them honestly and begun a real conversation. The Pope concluded by thanking all the participants and acknowledging that many people, both within the church and outside it, would be unhappy with what had transpired. But he believed that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was the only foundation on which genuine renewal could be built. The aftermath of the open forum exceeded even the most dramatic predictions. Within hours, the live stream had been viewed by over 50 million people worldwide, making it one of the most watched religious events in history. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from celebration to outrage. News outlets across the globe led with headlines about the unprecedented dialogue, and opinion pieces flooded both secular and religious publications. The response within the Catholic Church itself was deeply divided. Progressive Catholics felt vindicated and energized, seeing the open forum as evidence that real change might finally be possible. They organized watch parties, prayer groups, and discussion circles to continue the conversations that had begun. Many younger Catholics who had drifted away from the Church expressed renewed interest, intrigued by a leadership that seemed willing to acknowledge problems rather than simply defending tradition. Conservative Catholics, however, viewed the event as a disaster. They saw the Pope's admissions of uncertainty and institutional failure as weakness that would undermine the Church's authority. Some accused him of betraying 2,000 years of tradition to appease secular critics. The most extreme voices began calling for his resignation, while others organized campaigns to pressure bishops and cardinals to rein in what they viewed as the Pope's dangerous reforms. Cardinal Rossini, who had been sitting in the front row during the entire open forum with a face like carved stone, called an emergency meeting of like-minded conservative clergy. In that private gathering, he reportedly argued that the Pope had overstepped his authority and that the faithful had a duty to resist these changes. While he stopped short of explicitly calling for rebellion, his message was clear enough. He was organizing opposition that would make any further reforms extremely difficult to implement. Alessandro found himself at the center of a media storm, unlike anything he had experienced in his musical career. Interview requests came from every major news organization. He was invited to speak at universities, religious gatherings, and civic organizations. Some wanted him to elaborate on his criticisms of the Church, while others hoped he would defend the Pope against conservative backlash. The pianist tried to navigate these waters carefully, not wanting to make things harder for Pope Leo XIII, but also not willing to soften his message about needed change. One interview request particularly moved Alessandro. It came from a small Catholic school in his hometown of Naples. The principal explained that their students had watched the open forum and had many questions about faith, doubt, and how to navigate loving the Church while acknowledging its problems. Would Alessandro be willing to come speak with them? Despite his packed schedule, the pianist immediately agreed. These young people represented the future of the Church, and their questions mattered more than any high-profile media appearance. When Alessandro arrived at the school a week later, he was greeted by about 100 teenagers who filled the gymnasium. They sat on bleachers, some looking curious, others skeptical, a few clearly hostile. The principal introduced Alessandro and then left him to face the students directly. The pianist decided to skip any prepared remarks and simply opened the floor for questions. The first hand that went up belonged to a girl of about 16. She asked Alessandro if he still considered himself Catholic after everything he had said about the Church. It was a fair question that got right to the heart of things. Alessandro thought for a moment before answering that yes, he did still consider himself Catholic, but his understanding of what that meant had evolved. He explained that he believed being Catholic was about following the teachings of Jesus regarding love, justice, and care for the vulnerable, not about blindly accepting every decision made by church institutions. A boy in the back row stood up and angrily challenged Alessandro for disrespecting the Pope. He said his grandmother had been devastated by the performance and felt that Alessandro had attacked everything she held sacred. The pianist acknowledged this pain and admitted that his actions at the concert had been confrontational. He explained that sometimes speaking uncomfortable truths required being bold, even at the risk of hurting feelings. But he genuinely regretted causing pain to faithful people who found comfort in the Church. Another student asked what had surprised Alessandro most about his private conversations with the Pope. This question made the pianist smile. He shared that he had expected to find either a defensive bureaucrat or someone completely out of touch with reality. Instead, he discovered a thoughtful, conflicted man who was more aware of the church's problems than Alessandro had imagined, but who struggled with how to change such a massive institution. The Pope's vulnerability and honesty had been completely unexpected. The questions continued for over 2 hours, far longer than the scheduled hour. Students wanted to know about everything from how to deal with doubts about their faith to whether the Catholic Church would ever truly accept LGBTQ people. Alessandro answered as honestly as he could, never claiming to have all the answers but sharing his own journey and encouraging the students to think critically while remaining connected to their values. As the session ended, several students approached Alessandro privately. One young man tearfully shared that he was gay and had been told by his priest that he needed to choose between his identity and his faith. Alessandro listened compassionately and suggested that perhaps he did not need to choose, that God's love was big enough to embrace all of who he was. Another student, a girl considering religious life, asked whether Sister Catherine's story meant women would never have equal roles in the church. Alessandro admitted he did not know but encouraged her to pursue her calling regardless, because the church needed strong women willing to push for change from within. Back at the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV was dealing with increasingly organized resistance. A group of 43 bishops, primarily from the United States, Poland, and several African nations, had released a joint statement questioning the theological soundness of the open forum discussions. They stopped short of directly challenging the Pope's authority, but made their disapproval clear. Several wealthy conservative donors threatened to cut funding to various church projects if the Pope continued down this path. The pressure was taking its toll. The Pope's personal secretary noticed that he was sleeping less and seemed more burdened than energized by the response to the open forum. During their daily briefings, the secretary urged caution and perhaps slowing down the pace of proposed reforms, but the Pope refused. He felt that retreating now would betray everyone who had found hope in the possibility of change. The momentum had to be maintained even as the opposition grew stronger. Then something unexpected happened that changed the trajectory of the entire situation. A prominent American cardinal named Michael O'Brien, who had been expected to align with the conservative opposition, instead released a personal statement supporting the Pope's initiative. Cardinal O'Brien was not known as a progressive, and his dioceses included many traditional Catholics. His statement acknowledged that he had initially been uncomfortable with the open forum format and some of what was discussed. But after prayer and reflection, he had come to believe that honest self-examination was not a betrayal of tradition, but rather a necessary part of institutional health. Cardinal O'Brien's statement was significant because it broke the appearance of unified conservative opposition. He was followed by several other moderate bishops who had been sitting on the fence, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. They began speaking up in support of at least some of the reforms being proposed, particularly increased financial transparency and better abuse prevention measures. The opposition was still substantial, but it was no longer monolithic. Encouraged by this shift, the Pope moved forward with forming the special commissions he had promised. The Abuse Investigation Panel was given unprecedented independence and resources. The Financial Transparency Committee began the complex work of cataloging Vatican assets and expenditures. Most controversially, the Synod on Women's Role in the Church was officially scheduled, despite furious protests from conservative factions. Alessandro continued to receive messages from people around the world, sharing how the open forum had affected them. One letter came from Thomas, the abuse survivor who had first written after Alessandro's performance. He wrote that he had watched the entire open forum and been moved by the Pope's willingness to admit failures. While nothing could undo the harm he had suffered, he felt for the first time that the institutional church was at least beginning to take responsibility. He was not ready to return to practicing his faith, but he was no longer carrying the same level of anger and hurt. That shift, he said, was healing in itself. Another message came from a priest in Brazil who had been on the verge of leaving the priesthood due to disillusionment. He wrote that the open forum had given him hope that working for change from within was still possible. He was staying and rededicating himself to serving his community, while also pushing for the reforms they needed. Stories like these reminded Alessandro why the confrontation at the concert, uncomfortable as it had been, was necessary. About 6 weeks after the open forum, Pope Leo XIV invited Alessandro back to the Vatican for a private dinner. This time the meeting felt less urgent and more reflective. They discussed what had happened in the week since their public dialogue, acknowledging both the progress and the significant challenges that remained. The Pope admitted that there were days when he questioned whether he had moved too quickly or promised more than he could deliver. Alessandro asked the Pope what he would say to people who argued that while the conversations were nice, real institutional change would never happen. The Pope was quiet for a moment before responding. He said that he had learned over the past weeks that change in an institution like the Catholic Church could not be measured in days or months, but rather in years and decades. Some of the reforms they discussed might not be fully realized in his lifetime, but by beginning the honest conversation, by acknowledging problems rather than denying them, he hoped they were planting seeds that would eventually bear fruit. 1 year after the concert that changed everything, Alessandro Moretti returned to the Vatican for another performance. This time the invitation came without controversy or surprise. It was planned as part of a larger event celebrating the first anniversary of the Open Forum initiative, and reflecting on what had been accomplished, what challenges remained, and where the Church would go from here. The past 12 months had been transformative, though not in the dramatic overnight way that some had hoped for or others had feared. Real institutional change moved slowly, like a massive ship adjusting its course by degrees rather than sharp turns, but movement was undeniable. The Abuse Investigation Commission had completed its first major report, resulting in the removal of several bishops who had protected predatory priests. Financial statements detailing Vatican assets and expenditures had been published for the first time in history, revealing both greater wealth and also significant charitable work that had previously gone unpublicized. The Synod on Women's Roles in the Church had concluded just 2 months earlier. It did not result in immediate approval of female ordination, disappointing many progressive Catholics. But it did lead to the creation of new leadership positions for women in Vatican departments, removal of some barriers to women's participation in church governance, and an official acknowledgement that the question of women's ordination deserved continued theological exploration, rather than being dismissed as permanently settled. It was far less than some hoped for, but more progress than anyone had thought possible a year earlier. Pope Leo XIV had also initiated 3 more open forum dialogues over the course of the year, each focusing on different challenging topics. One addressed the Church's relationship with LGBTQ Catholics, another explored economic justice and the Church's role in addressing global poverty, and a third examined how the Church could better serve young people who increasingly felt disconnected from traditional religious institutions. Each dialogue generated passionate responses, both positive and negative, but they kept difficult conversations alive rather than letting them be swept back under the carpet of institutional silence. The conservative opposition remained strong. Cardinal Rossini and his allies had not given up their resistance. They formed what they called the Guardians of Tradition, a network of clergy and lay Catholics committed to preserving what they saw as the Church's timeless teachings against modern corruption. They held their own conferences, published their own statements, and worked to limit the implementation of reforms at the diocesan level. The tension between reformist and traditionalist factions within the Church was higher than it had been in decades. Alessandro's own life had changed significantly as well. His musical career had reached new heights, with concert halls around the world eager to book the pianist who had challenged the Pope. But he had also become something of an accidental activist, regularly invited to speak about institutional change, finding one's voice and balancing criticism with constructive engagement. He tried to remain focused on his music while honoring the responsibility that came with the platform his Vatican performance had given him. Several major orchestras approached Alessandro about premiering his composition, Requiem for the Forgotten, the piece he had played instead of Mozart on that fateful night. He agreed to a series of performances, with all proceeds going to organizations that supported abuse survivors and worked for church reform. The piece became a powerful symbol of the possibility that even painful truths, when expressed honestly, could create something beautiful and transformative. On the evening of the anniversary concert, Alessandro stood once again in the Vatican's Grand Hall, but the atmosphere could not have been more different from a year earlier. This time there was no tension or surprise. Everyone knew what they were there for. The audience included many of the same people who had participated in or witnessed the first open forum, along with new faces representing the ongoing work of reform. Pope Leo XIV opened the evening with a speech that was characteristically honest about both progress and limitations. He acknowledged that many people were frustrated with the pace of change, feeling that the Church was not moving fast enough. He also recognized that others felt things were moving too fast, that traditions were being abandoned without adequate consideration. He admitted that satisfying everyone was impossible, and that leadership often meant disappointing people on all sides, while trying to navigate toward what seemed like the right path. The Pope then spoke directly about Alessandro, thanking the pianist for his courage a year earlier. He said that Alessandro's bold performance had been a gift to the Church, even though it had not felt like a gift in the moment. It had broken through the careful politeness that usually characterized Vatican events and forced honest conversation about real problems. Without that catalyst, the Pope admitted, he might have continued avoiding difficult questions, finding it easier to maintain comfortable illusions than confront uncomfortable realities. When Alessandro took the stage this time, he felt different than he had a year earlier. Then, he had been driven by frustration and a need to speak truth regardless of consequences. Now he felt a more nuanced understanding of the complexity of institutional change and the genuine struggles of people trying to reform systems from within. He played Mozart beautifully, the piece that had originally been scheduled for the previous year's concert. But he also played Requiem for the Forgotten again, this time as a reminder of why the work of reform must continue. After the performance, the evening shifted to a panel discussion about the past year and the road ahead. Alongside the Pope sat Sister Catherine, Father Dominic Maria Santos, and Cardinal Martinez, along with several new voices including representatives from the Abuse Survivors Network, the Financial Transparency Committee, and the Women's Synod. Alessandro joined them on the stage, no longer just a performer but now recognized as part of the ongoing conversation about the Church's future. The discussion was frank and sometimes contentious. Sister Catherine expressed disappointment that more progress had not been made on women's ordination. Father Dominic challenged the Church to match its words about poverty with more aggressive asset redistribution. An abuse survivor on the panel spoke about how the investigation commission's work, while valuable, could not undo the trauma that had been inflicted or restore what had been stolen from victims. These were not easy conversations, and the discomfort in the room was palpable at times. But the Pope did not try to smooth over the tensions or offer false reassurances. Instead, he acknowledged the validity of frustrations and the reality that meaningful change required patience that felt unbearable to those who were hurting or waiting for justice. He spoke about his own moments of despair over the past year, when progress seemed impossibly slow and opposition seemed overwhelming. He admitted that there were times when he questioned whether any of this was making a real difference. Maria Santos, who had been mostly quiet during the discussion, finally spoke up. She said something that shifted the tone of the entire conversation. She acknowledged that yes, the pace of change was frustratingly slow, and yes, there was still so much work to be done, but she also pointed out that a year earlier, they had not even been able to have these conversations publicly. The fact that they could sit on a Vatican stage and openly challenge church leadership about its failures represented a fundamental shift in institutional culture. That shift might seem small compared to what was still needed, but it was not nothing. Alessandro found himself nodding in agreement. He thought about all the messages he had received over the past year, from people who had felt alone in their doubts and criticisms, until the open forum gave them permission to voice their concerns. He remembered the students in Naples who had asked such thoughtful questions about navigating faith and doubt. He thought about Thomas and others who had been wounded by the Church, but were beginning to heal because someone had finally acknowledged their pain. These individual transformations might not show up in policy documents or official statements, but they mattered immensely. As the evening drew to a close, Pope Leo XIV made an announcement. He declared that the open forum would become a permanent institution, with regular dialogues scheduled quarterly and open to anyone who wanted to raise concerns or challenge the Church. He also announced the establishment of a new Vatican office, dedicated to listening to and responding to feedback from Catholics around the world, particularly those whose voices had traditionally been marginalized or ignored. These announcements were met with mixed reactions. Some in the audience applauded enthusiastically, seeing them as evidence of sustained commitment to reform. Others remained skeptical, wondering if these initiatives would eventually fade into bureaucratic irrelevance like so many church reform efforts before them. The conservative faction present made their disapproval clear through stony silence. After the official program ended, there was a reception where attendees mingled and continued conversations. Alessandro found himself talking with a young cardinal from Argentina, who admitted that he had been opposed to the open forum initially, but had gradually come to see its value. The cardinal said that the most important thing he had learned over the past year was that the church could survive honest self-examination, and that perhaps it could not survive without it. At one point during the reception, Pope Leo XIV pulled Alessandro aside for a private moment. The two men stood near a window overlooking the Vatican gardens, now bathed in moonlight. The Pope thanked Alessandro again, not just for the original performance but for his continued engagement over the past year. He admitted that there had been many difficult moments when he had been tempted to pull back from the reforms and return to safer, more traditional approaches. But knowing that people like Alessandro were watching and hoping for change had helped him maintain his resolve. Alessandro asked the Pope if he had any regrets about the path they had set in motion a year earlier. The Pope thought carefully before responding. He said that he regretted the pain that had been caused, particularly to conservative Catholics who felt their faith was being undermined, and to progressive Catholics who felt change was not happening fast enough. He wished he could have found ways to bring more people along without such conflict. But no, he did not regret the fundamental decision to pursue honest dialogue and genuine reform, even knowing all the challenges it would bring. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, Alessandro stood for a moment in the grand hall where everything had begun. He remembered the nervousness he had felt walking onto that stage a year earlier, uncertain of what would happen but determined to speak his truth. He thought about all that had transpired since then, the conversations, the conflicts, the small victories, and ongoing frustrations. The work of reforming an ancient institution was messy, slow, and incomplete, but it was happening and that mattered. Alessandro left the Vatican that night with a sense of cautious hope. He knew that the resistance to change remained strong, and that many battles were still ahead. He understood that some of the reforms being discussed might never be fully realized, or might take decades to implement, but something fundamental had shifted. The Church was having honest conversations about its failures and its future. People who had felt voiceless were being heard. The possibility of transformation, however gradual, was real. As he walked through Rome's quiet streets back to his apartment, Alessandro thought about the power of a single moment of courage to catalyze change. His performance a year earlier had lasted only minutes, but it had set in motion ripples that continued spreading outward. He had learned that challenging institutions from outside was important, but that supporting those working for change from within was equally crucial. Real transformation required both prophetic voices calling for justice and patient reformers working through complex systems. The story of Pope Leo XIII and the pianist who challenged him would be told and debated for years to come. Some would remember it as the beginning of the Church's renewal, while others would see it as the start of its decline. But for Alessandro, for the Pope, and for countless others who had been touched by what happened, it represented something simpler but profound. It was proof that even the most ancient and seemingly unchangeable institutions could be moved by honest voices, that truth spoken bravely could create space for transformation, and that hope for a better future was not naive but necessary. The work was far from finished, but at least it had truly begun.